Well, you've got a great treat this afternoon, as Aarathi is a Renaissance woman who combines in one frame a brilliant writer, a serious scientist and geneticist, an archaeologist, and now, to add to her many qualities, a mother of moths. And the mother of the Baronessa too, but that's different. When I first met her, she was growing cocoons in her kitchen and using old loo rolls to try and encourage them to hatch in unusual manners. And this was all part of the long-standing research for a book that took 6-7 years. It was a major work. It was a long-standing commitment, and you can see this in the book. The book is available for sale outside. You should all go and buy immediately a copy of Silk, because it brings together all these different facets: history, travel, history of science, genetics, biology, in some beauteous writing. So anyway, without any more flattery, Aarathi, over to you.
So I think that you all know what silk is, and I thought I knew what silk is when I started. And the silk I know, and the silk most of you will have at home, come from this beautiful creature, and it's called the Bombyx mori. This is the world's only truly domesticated insect, and it didn't actually exist before a few thousand years ago. And it didn't exist because it was bred by Neolithic farmers in China, in the east coast of China, to produce greater quantities of silk. This is its ancestor. It's called Bombyx mandarina mor. And I don't think you see the difference, but the Bombyx mori is very pale. They're very cute. But they're very boring. They don't do very much. They can't see when they're born blind, they can't fly, and they can't do anything. They need humans completely for them to breed, for them to feed. And their ancestor was well camouflaged. It flew very fast, but it was known as a pest to Chinese farmers because it ate their mulberry trees and ate the mulberry leaves. But it produced a very fine, very white, very beautiful silk. And that is why it's hard to imagine, why would you domesticate something if it didn't already produce something that was useful to you? But when you domesticate it, you want them to produce more of what you want. So the abdomens of the domesticated moth became bigger, fatter. The females produced more eggs. Sorry, I'm not doing very well. Yeah. So, yeah, we don't really know how long ago this happened, because genetic data, we just don't have enough of it from the wild. But if we take together what genetics we do know with the archaeological evidence, we think that it was domesticated somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago. This is a silk moth carved from a tusk of a boar. But to me, it looks like the larva of the ancestor rather than the larva of the domesticated moth. So people will say different things, but I think it's between 4,000 and 5,000 years old, and that's a very important number to keep in your minds. The Bombyx mori makes silk. It starts life as a tiny little egg that you saw, and then it eats copious amounts of mulberry leaves, white mulberry leaves. It's its favorite food. I don't know if you've ever kept mulberry, if you've ever tried to cultivate silkworms at home. My friends have, and they said, we fed it with lettuce, and the silk turned green. And that's perfectly true, and it's possible. You can do wonderful things. But the silk will never be of the finest quality unless you feed it its natural food, which is the white mulberry leaves. And it grows fatter and fatter, and it becomes very cute and very juicy caterpillar. And then, after some time, it stops. It stops eating, and it stops moving. And that's a very, very, very dangerous thing for a juicy little caterpillar to do, because it's prone to predators. And it's prone to also a fungal and bacterial disease. And this is why it produces the silk it produces that we've now co-opted to make our textiles. It has silk glands running along its body, and the silk emerges through its salivary glands as liquid. And when it hits the air, it turns into a solid thread. And you'll see in my loo rolls at home, the caterpillar suspended two parts of the thread and started moving their heads around, wrapping themselves in what's sort of 2 kilometers of silk thread if you stretch it out fully. And the cocoon's about this big, and that's about 2 kilometers, 1 to 2 kilometers of thread, unbroken. And inside it develops into an adult form that resembles nothing like the caterpillar that it started from. It becomes a moth. But if you want to unreel the thread in one continuous seam, you're not going to want the moth to break out of the cocoon, because when it does that, it vomits an enzyme that's sort of a rusty red. It's still on my fireplace. It's very hard to get off, but it breaks the thread. So then what you have is what you see when you buy piece silks. You let the moth emerge from the cocoon, and it breaks the thread, but then you tie the thread back together, and you have little bumps in the textile. And I think that's quite beautiful, but if people don't want it, then they either stifle, suffocate, or boil the cocoons, and so the insect doesn't emerge from the cocoon. One of the reasons you boil it is also to release the thread, because that cocoon that you just saw, it's not soft and it's not fluffy. There's a little bit of floss, but it's as hard as a rock. It feels like it looks like the surface of the moon, and it's very, very solid. And you boil it with something soapy, like an alkaline solution, and then you pull strands of the thread, and that's when you start reeling it to get the fabrics. The silk is an incredible material because it's very, very fine, but it's incredibly strong. And the reason it has these wonderful properties, high tensile strength, is because it has a very, very, very boring molecular structure. It just repeats on and on and on. But we don't have to worry ourselves about that. But people did notice that. Throughout history, people noticed that silk had incredible properties. And that was not just in strength. It was used for body armor. Genghis Khan issued it, standard issue, to every soldier in his army, a very thin but layered shirt made of silk. And that's because if you get shot by an arrow, it's not very nice. But what's even worse is having it removed, because it twists into the wound. But if it twists through a silk cloth, then it's easier to remove the arrow, but also the silk that they knew, because it was used as surgical suturing in ancient India, ancient China, ancient Greece, was that it had healing properties, antibacterial properties, so it helped the wound then to heal. It was also used in the Wild West, because there was a doctor in a town called Tombstone. It was a deadly place. He was married to a woman whose surname was Colt. Her family owned the gun company. But he was very much interested in keeping people alive, and he was a pacifist. But he noticed that people in the Wild West, even though they were wearing thick felt hats, they were wearing denim jackets, they were wearing undercoats, they were wearing metal rims around their hats, the bullets would penetrate all of those things. But if they had a silk handkerchief in their pockets folded up in a number of times, the bullet did not penetrate through their bodies. And so he became very interested in this. In Chicago in the 19th century, a Polish priest formulated a piece of body armor that he had tested on himself. And this silk vest was tested by the British Royal Armouries in 2014 with replica ammunition and guns and bullets that would have been used by Zeppelin, and they protected him, and he didn't get a scratch. So I told you that these are domesticated moths, and the thing about domesticated animals is that humans manipulate them. I'm not saying it's a good thing, I'm saying they were available throughout the silk industries across the world, and that means that scientists study them as well. Scientists were able to study them, and now they're being used for future innovations. I don't know if you went to the seaweed session, but we have this pernicious problem of plastic in the world, and plastics are polymers, and they're made from fossil fuels, but silk can also be made into a biopolymer. And so a lot of innovations are being made at the moment it's a no-brainer, use it as replacements for plastic, cups and bags, but also for food waste, but very interestingly also for electronic waste, because silk can be used as a human electronic interface. And also for sustainable building of architectural elements. But I'm saying all this because all of these innovations have been made from the Bombyx mori, the domesticated silk moth, but it is not the only silk moth in the world. And that's what I realized when I went to the Natural History Museum when I started doing research on the book. And I opening drawers, and all of these moths started falling out, and all of these cocoons brought from all over the world, tagged with things like Paris Exhibition in 1878. And I went to the curators and said, "What is this?" And they said, "I don't know. Can you find out?" And it turns out that in the 19th century, people were, and this was part of the colonial enterprise that you talked about, find the coal, find the trees, find the animals, find anything that moved. Let's see what economic value it has and bring it back. And so people went out there who were military men, who were doctors, but what they certainly weren't was entomologists, because entomology did not exist as a field at that time. And they collected all of these moths from around the world and they brought it back to England. And in the great colonial exhibitions, they displayed them and they said that this would be an interesting alternative to silk. People started going across the world to as part of the colonial enterprise. One of them was this lady, Marianne, who was German. She was known as a flower painter. She was also involved in embroidering silk. Her uncle was a silk merchant. And she was about 53 when she went. She got on a ship with her younger daughter and went to Suriname because she wanted to study insects, and she wanted to study the metamorphoses of insects in their natural environment. And that's really important because at the time, people were sending samples back to Europe from all over the world. Being that she was Dutch, they were sending them back from the Dutch colonies, Indonesia and Suriname. But they were sending them back dead. So there were crocodiles and snakes and moths pinned to boards. And she said, "How on earth can I study a dead animal? I want to see what they do in the wild." And so she's known as one of the mothers of ecology. But so she went to Suriname, and what did she do? Partly because she was a woman, she was able to speak to other women. Sadly, that meant speaking to enslaved African people, but also enslaved indigenous women. And they would tell her things that they wouldn't tell the men. And one of the insects that she discovered was a large wild moth that produced a very beautiful silk that she sent back to Holland and said, "I think you should use this to make textiles with." And I tried to track down what happened to it, and I couldn't find out. It had disappeared. But South America wasn't the only place where these moths had come from. As I started finding in the Natural History Museum, these moths are distributed all over the world. There are many, many species across Africa, and these are traditional woven items made of wild silk from Cameroon, Democratic Republic, Congo, from Nigeria, from Madagascar, from Malawi, from Kenya, from Tanzania. And one of them was used as a death shroud. In China, you'd find carvings of silk worms in tombs, and we think they represented metamorphosis. So you die, but then you re-emerge. But in a very practical sense, these people were scientists because people knew their natural environment. And they used a specific species of moth. They used the silk from it to wrap their dead in because it was known to be rot-proof. And this is Irene Good, Dr. Irene Good. Sadly died of cancer before I was able to meet her, but she was based in Harvard. And she made the point that when you are excavating in China, she's a textile expert, an archaeologist. When you excavate in China, if you find a string or a fabric, you're going to test it to see if it was silk. But if you find that in Mexico or India or Madagascar, why would you? Because there was no silk. But that's exactly what she set out to do. And she went to... One of the places she went to was the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and they have the biggest collection of Indus Valley artifacts outside of India and Pakistan. And in some of those items, one was a bangle made of bronze, and one was a necklace made of beads, and there was another item as well. She found that there were the threads made of silk, and they came from 2 or 3 species of silk moths that I was about to say were wild. But in the threads, they were 65 to 75 strands of thread wrapped together and placed inside the materials as string. And she found that some of them were unbroken. And so what does unbroken mean? It means that they were they were starting to domesticate, or they were boiling the cocoons or taking the threads from them rather than collecting them just from the wild. The wild ancestor of the domesticated moth I showed you is not just in China. It has spread from China across through the foothills of the Himalayas. And so that moth was present in many places in Asia, and certainly into Pakistan and India. And the strings inside the jewelry from the Indus Valley came from 2 to 3 different species of moths, 2 from Assam and 1 from the tropical west coast of India. And these are some of the moths that the silk has come from. So at the moment in India, you recognize it from the painting. They are collected from trees in the wild. They are not tiny little moths. They are as big as 2 adult hands. And they are allowed to have their cocoons on the trees. And in the image you showed of Zainuddin, you will have noticed that the cocoon on the tree was hung by a sort of stem, right? So I was wondering about this because when Chinese silk first went to the West, people didn't really know what it was and where it came from because the luster was so incredible. And the Romans made a particular point of saying, we think this grows on trees. And I think it's because they saw the Indian species. But huge cocoons. And the silk is very tough. It's passed down through generations. Very interesting in technology because it's so much stronger. It's paralleling another silk that is the holy grail of silk that I'll show you in a moment in terms of strength. And so it gives us a lot of opportunities to make new innovations. Do you know what this is, William?
This is Madagascar spider silk.
This is the golden orb spider from Madagascar. It makes a web that will go across this room, suspended by twine, golden twine, that runs for meters. And it's the natural color of the silk. And this is your friend Simon Pearce. A few years ago, he made a cape out of this golden spider silk. This is the natural color of it. So this article that I took this from says he spent 5 years collecting 1.2 million. I think he told me he spent 8 years and collected 2 million spiders. And now I'll show you in a minute, it's only the females that make it. And he said, it's because at first I sent these women out with baskets to collect spiders, and they collected so many spiders, and they came back to the studio with the basket. And then they opened the basket, and there was just one very happy spider inside because they cannibalized each other. So it's been incredibly difficult to get enough spider silk to do anything with. But he managed this. It's still in the V&A?
Yep.
Yeah.
I've got one he made, but not from the gold.
Not from the golden orb. But this is she. This is the male. He doesn't last long. But she's about this big. Really magnificent species.
Don't get any ideas, girls.
And they're spread throughout. You know, you find them in Australia, you find them in many countries, and so this is something that people around the world did use. So people were making silks, and they were making it from very interesting animals. In Madagascar, Simon Pearce wasn't the first. There was a priest called Paul Cambouet who was French, and there was another priest in South America called Termeyer. And both of them said, we can't get enough silk. And they didn't do what Simon did, send women out with baskets. They decided we'd create a contraption. It was called a guillotine, and they'd immobilize the body of the spider and tickle their abdomens. And when the silk emerged, pull it directly from their bodies, which hurt. I think it hurt because one of the scientists said they should be anesthetized, but it doesn't kill them. And so they'd run off very angrily, but they'd survive, and then they'd be harvested from again. This is termites and also wilders. This is being pulled out from there. So spiders make a number of different kinds of silk, some to wrap their eggs, some to drop from, it's extremely strong, another type to build their webs, and they all emerge from different glands, and they have a different makeup, which is incredible. And because it's been so hard to get any silk out of spiders, different approaches have been used, including trying to get yeast and bacteria. We genetically modify them with spider genes so that they produce the silk when they replicate. And this is Professor Randy Lewis in Utah, and he genetically modified a goat, which became known as spider goat. So when you milk the goat, you get spider silk in the milk, and then you have to take it back to a solid, which wasn't very easy. I think they're all on a farm now, I think you can adopt. I quite like one. They're very cute. I just wanted to end by saying that silk is not just global, and it's not, people wherever in the world they were natural scientists themselves, and they observed the world and used it for their purposes. But they're not the only animals that make it. We have the spiders as well. But there are all manner of animals that scientists are looking at in order to try and replicate what nature's been able to do. We can't make spider silk. People say that, what a spider does on a diet of bugs, we, with all our scientific technology, still cannot replicate. This is a tiny little shrimp, and it makes a thread, it spins a thread that's partway between the strength of spider silk and the glue that barnacles use to fix themselves to ships' hulls. And this is I'll end with this. This is my absolute favorite. It's called a pinna nobilis. It's a mollusk, like the mussels that you eat. If you ever notice, there's a little thread that comes out of it. And that's to affix itself to the sea. But these are about a meter tall. This is Taranto in the 1930s. But it produces a thread that's about this long. And it changes color, gold, green, bronze. It's absolutely beautiful. And it affixes us to the sea. And these animals have been around, well, forever. And the problem with archaeology is you don't find textiles, right? So we don't actually know how long it was used. But they have found tiny spools and very fine weaving equipment.
Where?
In the Mediterranean world. Because the spread of this is from North Africa up to Croatia, all of the Mediterranean region. And there are copious amounts of shells of this animal, huge shells everywhere. And then there are these Minoan frescoes. So people say that these women, these priestesses, are holding torches. But then they say you wouldn't hold a piece of something that's hot like that. And some people think that this is a relative of the pinna nobilis, called the pinna rudis. And if you look at the paintings of their clothes, they're like this. You can see how finely they're made. Also that and saffron, because they dyed with saffron flowers. They were easy to fish. They live on the seabed. They're not very far down, a lot of them. And you put this contraption down, you twist it. And the hair is here, the silk, the sea silk it's called. And people ate it. There's a lot of meat. What would you call it? Meat, fish, whatever. Protein inside. And the Romans said it tasted, everyone says it tasted very bad, but it's also diuretic. So it wasn't desirable, but if you were poor enough, you'd eat it. So they had access to the silk as well. The only good record we have of the fact that this silk existed, except for the Islamic princes of Cordoba, because they talked about it, the Chinese wrote saying that we know that in Europe they have silk that's grown from sheep in the sea. And then in the 1930s, there was a scientist who found a mummy. This is a woman, her head is here, and she's wrapped in the style of an Egyptian mummy. And she was in a place called Aquincum, which is now just outside of Budapest in Hungary. And that was one of the northernmost colony stations of the Romans. And from the graveyards, you can see that most of the soldiers were from Libya, Egypt, Africa, so the Mediterranean region. Since then, they've found a lot of women, particularly women, buried in the Egyptian style as well. But the thing about her is she was wearing a dress, and that dress was made of sea silk. And in the Second World War, we know what Hungary did, and it was bombed, and the Museum of Aquincum was bombed, and the only sample we had of ancient sea silk was destroyed. So I called emailed the museum, and I said, I know this is gone, but is there anything you have? Can I come and see it? So we get to the museum. They open it. My daughter jokes that they opened this museum, this closed museum. She said, are you a spy? And I said, do you have a mummy? And she said, yes. And we went down to the basement, and there in this casket was this woman, a young woman, who was very well preserved, and she was wrapped in bandages of hemp, so cannabis, which is another fiber that was very commonly used in the ancient world. And I said, yes, but was there any silk? She said, oh, yes, but when they took the cover off of the sarcophagus, there was a very fine fabric laying over her, and it just went like shh and vanished as it hit the air, because it was disintegrated by the effect of the air, but also all the microbes it had been exposed to. So that's my absolute favorite silk. We know it's that silk because it has a very particular linguine shape under a microscope, so we're very sure. Also, Irene Good at Harvard figured out the ancient Indus silk, that it was from these moths because she looked very closely at the silk threads and it matched the shape of the orifices from each of these moths, and that's how she was able to tell. So we need a lot more research, but I think if we look, we will find that these silks are distributed in places more widely and were used in more ancient times by more people than we have ever realized. Thank you.
So in the kind of Sanjeev Bhaskar vein, where, you know, royal family, India, and Leonardo da Vinci, India, can we say that silk, India, thanks to...
Yes, so you know at the beginning I told you, we don't, you see, people like to claim things, and in India as well, and in China as well, you have to take it with a pinch of salt. I'm working from a very good Chinese scientist who's based at Harvard, who's looking at the genetic origins of the silk moths. People say all kinds of things. They find a cocoon, and it's not a Bombyx mori cocoon, but they say we found a cocoon, and therefore it's it's like a gazillion years old, right? But as far as we know, it's 4,000 to 5,000 years old. The ones from the Indus are exactly the same age.
And they're Bombay Morix?
No.
What are they?
They were the beautiful, the Zainuddin moths, the wild
ancestor,
moths.
yeah.
But in India, they had many kinds of silk moths, and one of them, the ones you were talking about with the looms in Bengal, with the Bengal famine, was the Bombyx mori. And I think in India they call that, my mother calls it pattu, and that was the Chinese silk. That's where the Kanjivaram silks that we wear are made from. So they used Chinese silks, but they had a whole range of...
Pattu is I think Pushtu just means a shawl.
Oh,
a
really?
Pattu blanket.
Right.
Yeah.
So the wild silks were worn as shawls because they're very warm and very thick. And when I first saw it, the Tassar silk, I said to the guy, this isn't silk, this is cotton. He's like, nope, it's silk. So what I'm saying is, from what Irene has found, the age of the silk industry in India is
predates.
No, it's the same as it.
Same.
It's the same as in China, and they're using different moths, but we don't know because the evidence, we haven't found it. But this is a clue that's intriguing enough to say, well, because by the way, in China they use wild moths as well. It's not that they just use the Bombyx mori. And it could be that someone had been domesticating it. But yeah, I think for me it's
At one point you thought that the origin was Assam.
The origin is Assam. The origin is Assam. Assam is one of the places in the world that has one of the world's greatest biodiversity. And India is known as so there's a lot of wild moths in Africa, but nothing like India, and that's what the colonial machinery realized about India. They said that, you know, there's an encyclopedia of the products of India.
Right.
You know it? There's a few pages on tea and a few pages on, you know, other things that you think are very Indian. Silk takes up a huge portion of that book because the British knew that the wild silks you can get from India are of many varieties.
In the book that I'm publishing next autumn, I'm very skeptical about the existence of the so-called Silk Route at all before the Mongol period, that things were moving in a capillary action, just little short distances. But the idea that there's a motorway that's running from the Mediterranean to the China Sea, that is true at the time of Marco Polo. Marco Polo can set off from Antioch and reach Xanadu, whatever, 3 years later or 2 years later. But it's not true in you know, Roman periods, because you've got Persia in between and they're at war. And if you look at Roman trading manuals, there's a book called The Periplus, which has no idea about the existence of China beyond one sentence, which says, it is said there is a city called Thina, which is very hard to get to, where silk can be produced. It can, however, then goes on to say, be bought with great ease in Gujarat. And the Roman down the Red Sea, the Roman trading vessels come backwards and forwards 120 a year, moving from the Red Sea coast of Egypt with the monsoon down to Gujarat and Kerala and back again. So as far as the Romans were concerned, if you wanted to buy silk from China, you bought it, or silk at all, you bought it from Gujarat. From Baragaza was the port that it recommends
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I mean, you see stashes of black pepper that some idiot Roman forgot, but because it was very valuable, and that came from the Malabar coast of India. And yeah, so in terms of trade routes, I agree with you, because when they said that, when Procopius said that Emperor...
Procopius comes out, tell that story, because we haven't actually had that story, about how, so up to a certain point, the Chinese method of producing silk is a state secret in China. And silk is a very valuable product in China. It is used often as an alternative to currency, and bolts of silk are given, for example, to nomad tribes on their borders to keep them quiet.
Yeah.
And if you're good and you don't go and raid us, you get 500 bolts of raw silk. But the secret gets broken, and
yeah, I mean, the Mughal emperors did the same thing, but I don't know if it was a state secret, though.
Yeah?
Yeah. I don't know if that's true, because I think they definitely gave it to the Mongols, they were giving it to Korea and Japan, and I think silk...
But tell the Byzantine story.
I'll tell the Byzantine story, because the thing about silk is it's not just which moth do you get it from, it's how do you weave it, and the Chinese had immense technology in creating the weaves that gave it this lustrous shine. And so the Byzantine story is, so Procopius said that these monks went to India. But then, as you were saying, what is India? What is this place called India? And I suspect, from what I've seen, that it is Central Asia. And they said they walked...
And there are Byzantine coins from the age of Justinian found in what's Xinjiang. And it's the first time you get Roman coins in any number east of the Pamirs.
And what's wonderful there is the desert's very dry, and it preserves things like bales of silk very, very well. And so there are also dried mulberry trees that were there. So if you're trying to tell me that these monks...
Khotan also had
Khotan, exactly, Khotan.
Yeah.
Where that these monks went to China and walked back, and the story was they hid it in their canes, the eggs of the moths. And as we know, if you put eggs of a moth in a cane and walked for 2 years, well, they'd be dead, because they wouldn't get to hatch out, there'd be nothing to eat. So none of it makes any sense, and this is why I was trying to...
This is why your loo roll was so important.
This is why no, they need to be able to eat and weave their cocoons. And so I think that the place of origin where the silk technology left from was Merv in Turkmenistan, modern Turkmenistan.
What makes you feel that?
So Merv was a place of great learning.
A city of 1 million people, famously. Yeah.
That had libraries and great culture. If they had a great library, why would they not have Aristotle's books there, right? That had a lot of biological knowledge in it. And
Ibn Sina, or one of those guys, says that Merv has the most bookshops in the world. And if you want to go bookshop hunting, Merv is the place to...
And the other thing that they had a lot of was artisans. And when Genghis Khan came in and destroyed it, it was terrible. I mean, they killed everyone. They had people from outside the walls come back in, and then they killed them. And to get the remaining people, they had a call to prayer. And when the people came out, they murdered them. But the people he didn't kill were the artisans.
The
silk was
weavers,
really important to him for his armies, right? So they had the silk weaving technology, and I think it was from there that how you make silk and how you breed silkworms started going to the West.
But you've also told me that independently of this, in a completely different tradition, is it the island of Chios? One of those islands, that there is a wild silk tradition in the Aegean.
Yeah, that's the Pachypaisa otis, which are little moths, much like the Bombyx mori. So they made a wild silk. So they knew what silk was. But the thing about Chinese silk, you can't underestimate when Alexander the Great or when the Romans were standing there and these banners of silk that were shining. Like, what is this?
This is the Battle of Carrhae. There's the famous description. And the Romans blamed their defeat by the Persians on the fact that the Persians were using silk banners for the first time. It seems like a bad cop-out for a lost match. But
I wouldn't put it, but it was incredible, that luster in the sun, you know. It's not this kind of, this is silk, but it's woven a different way, you see. It's not that beautiful sheen. And so they didn't know what that was. And Persia, as you said, was standing in the way of Rome, and they wouldn't let them get anywhere near it. So what the Romans did, they'd get ready-made silk, and they'd take it back to, the Greeks and Romans, and they'd unravel the fabric and then weave it in with something else because they didn't have enough of it, yes.
And where was this happening in Byzantium? Where did you get the first silk farms in?
So there's this what is now Greek-Turkish border, but
Thrace.
Yes, and you have it's very good for mulberry trees there. And when I went to a place called Soufli, which is now in Greece, and you see the river, and after the river is Turkey, and they had this huge silk industry there, except all the mulberry trees were on the side that ended up being Turkey, and all the worms were on the side that ended up being Greece, and so they had a bit of a problem.
That's the end of the silk industry there.
But I think Italy was the place where the silk industry really took off in medieval times in Europe. And then
every cathedral treasury has the bones of saints wrapped in silk, doesn't it? It becomes the...
That's really interesting.
If you go to any of the big pilgrimage centres like Conques in France, you find that the bones of Saint-Foy are buried in early Byzantine or Persian silk. And a lot of the early Anglo-Saxon and Carolingian ornamentation is borrowed from silks from Persia or Byzantium. And you get these quadrupeds that start off life as sphinxes or come out of a Middle Eastern milieu, enter Anglo-Saxon art as coming out of the silk that the sculptors... So when you go somewhere like Bredon Hill in the middle of Northamptonshire, there are 9th century images on sculpture there, which is modelled on Byzantine and Persian griffins.
Well, the English were very envious of, the Italians and the French and anyone else who had silk industries, because they didn't. And King James in the 17th century, he had a silk advisor to him. He's paying someone to advise him on silk, and he's writing to all his aristocrats and saying, you must plant your lands with mulberry trees. Because we need to compete with the French silk industry.
Got to beat the French.
And people say that it failed because he said that we should plant red mulberry trees instead of white. But I don't think that's true, because his advisor knew very well what the correct mulberry trees were. So unless there was some sabotage, and he was partly working for the French. And then you had the American colonial centers, right? So Jamestown. This is where he said...
Which is the first English colony in Virginia.
The first English colony in Virginia. The same thing happened. He said, you've got to have a silk industry and plant lots of mulberry trees. And that failed because this other plant called tobacco came along.
Yes. Brought by Pocahontas' boyfriend.
Right.
Just to complete this on Questions. We have 10 more minutes for keen silkies. Sir, you had your hand up first. Any microphones?
Aarathi, that was fascinating. I never realized the implications for genetics and the emergence of silk. So it sounded to me when you described that amazing beast, that it sounded more like a developmental mutation rather than a long-term breeding program, if I can put it like that. So have you got any evidence for that, or is anyone investigating that now? Because moth genomes are really massively sequenced now, and so there must be a rare opportunity for a Nature paper if you could identify the genetic basis of the phenotype.
Young, I can't pronounce his name, sorry, but Young, who's at Harvard, that's a big project he's doing now.
Genome sequencing.
No, the problem is they don't have enough samples of the Bombyx mandarinum moor, the wild ancestor, from the spread of the place that it is thought to have been domesticated.
And is it completely disappeared?
No, it's still there. They're still the wild ancestors. It's just that but that's a very good question. Was it a random mutation? I don't know. I mean, obviously they're linked genes, so you change one thing and something else changes, like yellow chicken legs and conspecific violence. You know, it happens. You want to eat more chicken, so you want them to stop being violent to humans and each other, but then their legs turn a different color as well, right? Because the genes link. So it could be that the abdomens got bigger and they weren't able to fly. I don't know, but from all that I understand, it was a process of domestication. But maybe you're right. Maybe it was something they found that then they capitalized on.
Thank you.
Our next project.
That was a lovely talk, thank you. I was actually in Assam in December, and I was in Guwahati, and I went to a silk ecological silk farm, which was really lovely. But I think I'm either going potty, but they were boiling the cocoons, but it was in a sort of oil. Is that right?
If you used oil, it would damage the...
Well, then it wasn't an oil, but it
No.
looked all dark and sort of...
They
I
used
thought it was something oily.
It's
but I'm wrong.
it's an alkali, which is quite... Did it look bubbly?
I have to show a photograph later.
Yes, please, yeah. No, it's generally something like soap. Like you could do it at home with... I could throw my cocoons into fairy liquid or something and boil it with that, and that releases the sericin, the cement on the cocoon, so that you could draw it out. But unless... Were they trying to dye it in some way? It's very hard to dye.
No, they were just... we did see them pulling these kilometres of threads out. It was
yes.
amazing, yeah.
No, it would have been some soap-like stuff.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the talk. What got you interested in this topic in the first place, and were there any other topics that you were considering writing a book on while you came up with silk?
Yeah, I always have 100 ideas in my head, but I was writing a scientific paper on stem cells and regenerative medicine, and I was really interested.
As one does.
I was really interested in silk as a biomedical a substance for future technological uses. So it's a natural animal protein. When you boil it, you remove the sericin, and that stops the human immune system reacting to it. So you can implant it into the body. And I came to know of scientists making incredible things, replacements. So they've now created a vocal cord replacement based on silk because it's embedded well into the body. The scientists can also embed things, or you can attach them to tablets and tell it when to self-destruct so that it reports back to me if my mother's taken her medication. So I was interested in things like that, but also I think looking at natural biological materials are, to me, a better, more interesting way to approach health in the body. For example, if you had silk in a liquid form in a 3D printer and you printed a scaffold and then you seeded it with human bone cells and put it into the body, and the bone cells grew, and then you tell the silk to self-destruct, that means you're left with your own bone, whereas at the moment we have metal implants. So there are people working on all kinds of incredible things. But then I fell down the rabbit hole of the natural history, the history, the colonialism, because the reason is, when I studied science, no one tells you about the people who discovered things. Yeah, it's Parkinson's disease, but who was he and why did he do it? Like, I like to know. I think it's interesting because a lot of science, especially reproductive health in, say, America, where enslaved women were used for research purposes, I think we need to know the environment in which research and science was done. And in terms of a lot of the silk research and all the collections were done in British and French colonial times. And so even though things were found out, it was extremely extractive. And I think there are a lot of people who I would call scientists, the indigenous women, the enslaved people, who were natural historians. How could they not be? They lived amongst their natural world, and they observed the animals, and they knew what plants to use for abortions. And so, I couldn't detach those stories from what I was trying to write about, because it didn't feel right. I started writing a very sciencey book, and I wrote 15,000 words, and I threw it away, and I thought, that's not...
You actually did throw it away, didn't you?
Yes, I did, because I threw the whole
people
thing.
actually do this.
Yeah.
It wasn't even on your computer.
And then also the women, you have to piece
This was the COVID rage.
Well, everyone was clearing their house out and recycling, so I went to my bin. But then there was Isabella Gilbert, who you'll know from the Gilbert paintings, right? Yeah. So she was a daughter of British military personnel in India, and she was a natural historian, and she had Sitaram, I think,
Quite possibly.
painted their house in Calcutta. And she was also, like the MPs, was looking at insects and plants in India, and had a painter whose name we don't know drawing the natural history drawings for her. And a lot of species were named after her and her work that were at the Natural History Museum. And because I was writing this over lockdown, I couldn't go to the library, and I emailed them and said, do you have her notes? You must have them, because the Natural History Museum used them to name species. And all the librarians went off looking, and they couldn't find it. And the only place I found her notes were, they were sold on one of the big auction sites in 2016. And Henry Nolte from Edinburgh Botanical Gardens said to me, "Oh no," he said. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "When people buy books with scientific notes and beautiful drawings, they rip out the drawings and they throw the notes away." So here's this woman. There are all these women scientists who existed, but we have no idea who they are. And I had to try and piece together, mostly from the colonial records, who she was and where she worked and what work she did. But it was those people I wanted to forefront a bit more. Yeah, so it changed.
Do the silk-producing moths, do they need quite a specific climate to survive in, or are they just really hardy, and so silk production could happen anywhere because they would reproduce easily?
This is an excellent question, and I'll tell you why. So what Maria Marianne did when she said, "I want to go to Suriname and see the insects in the wild," I think it's a very good sustainable thing to do, to use silk as long as the water resources and things were used well, because these moths exist all over the world. And they don't only exist all over the world, but they need their specific habitat and their tree plants in order to survive. So if we make a silk industry for sustainable products based on those animals, we need to preserve the forests that they live in and their habitat. So then it's not, and as you were saying, it locks silk, carbon's locked into silk, carbon's locked into the mulberry trees, the food plants. We protect the forest. So a lot of the scientists now who I spoke to, so I went to them and I asked them about medical innovations, and it turned out what they were really interested in was environmental sustainability. And they said more important than anything that happens in European or American scientific bubbles is the fact that local people can now make sustainable innovations for themselves in the place where they live. So it's
quite temperate.
I mean, Cameroon, Madagascar, India, yeah, everywhere.
Has anyone tried to put the coding sequences of the spider silk into the Bombyx mori?
Yes.
And does it work?
You're a genius. Yes, so Randy Lewis, who has the goat, so he genetically modified E. coli bacteria, that's in the news again, because they rapidly replicate, so they're able to produce a lot. We do that a lot in the lab. Then he used yeast, the kind of yeast you make beer with, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and then he made the goat. And then he said, you know what the lab's doing now? We've just gone back to the Bombyx mori, because they've been doing it for thousands of years, so they know what to do. But what happens is you get a sequence that's part moth, part spider. And the spider's strength is not, silk strength is not just from the protein sequence. It's when it emerges, we call it protein conformation. It folds in a certain way, and we don't know how it does that. So it's still not known, but yeah, we'll keep trying.
Hi, yeah. You mentioned the possibility of using silk as a human electronic interface.
Yes.
Could you just talk a little bit more about that and what the practical applications of that might be?
Yeah, so Fiorenzo Omenetto, he's in Tufts University in Boston. He has a site called Silk Lab. He started off life as an electronic engineer, and his boss was working on some applications with the American military. So a lot of innovations like this come out of that little shrimp was being used by the military as well for underwater adhesives. How do you get things to stick underwater? Oh, there's this shrimp, right? So he's an electronic engineer, and he finds that silk has incredible properties. And so he's looking at making electronics based on silk. He said, I'm not going as far as the cyborg world, because if you implant those into the human brain, right, you have a whole additional level of sensors and reporting back what's happening in the body. So that's it's not out yet. It's being developed, and he's also made holograms with it. So there's a whole. I'm not an electronics. There's a whole range of innovations I don't understand, but it can quite seamlessly interface with the human body. Yeah.
It's a bit of a speculative question, but how would you imagine a world without silk?
I don't think there's ever been a world without silk, because from what I can see all over the world, we've looked at our natural environment and seen how to use what there is. And I know, like, it's not nice to boil insects, and I know, like, if you think about making silk, it's another extractive process. However, in some places where people use silk webs for fish nets, for example, or felted it, like in Vanuatu and Papua New Guinea, they would take a part of the web, not the whole thing. So it's about taking what we need and using what we have to, but not destroying what's around us. But as long as these animals are around and they're thriving, I think we can cooperate with nature rather than not. And I think I don't think there would be. It's thousand, maybe older, but it's millennia old, isn't it? Our relationship with silk.
Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause, please, for Aarathi Prasad.